So we go further into our investigation of intimate relationships by understanding communication. How many of you think you're a really good communicator? You're really good at sharing what you really feel? Or if you have somebody that you don't get along with, do you really get into the relationship or get into the discussion, or do you try to avoid it? So communication is something we need to really focus on, because I would say we are learning as a society how to be better communicators, but we're not perfect at it. Communication is an interactive process. It uses symbols like words and gestures that both send and receive messages. And so we have to recognize that even if we're not using language, our body language says something, our eyes rolling might say something. Sometimes when we laugh or cry, these are things that just communicate what's going on. Sometimes not saying and trying to be silent treatment says a lot. There's so much more to it, though, than just those symbols. We communicate by learning from our culture. Our culture in the United States is one that often tries to express that we are go-getters and pull yourself up by your bootstraps type of culture, very individualistic versus the big collectivists. So this is one thing as Americans, if you're an American student, that you will see that individualist sometimes be stressed by your culture. However, there are other cultures around the world that their countries or communities might be more collectivist, where things are all about we. Certain cultures, as we invite ourselves to be ethnically diverse, culturally diverse, and in different communities, might be on the spectrum of this individualist and collectivist. When you're part of a relationship with friends, family, or intimate relationships, you might want to see how the person is identifying in the world. Do they say I a lot? I think this, or I think that. Or do they say we? Because that makes a difference in where the perspective is coming from. That's a sense of that individualist versus collectivist. Also, where we can break down in our communication is the context. Not everyone trusts everybody right away. High versus low context cultures are different. For example, small towns can seem really friendly and polite, but that can sometimes make people from city or urban communities very uncomfortable, because we have that talkative country background. As a whole, Americans are pretty talkative as a culture. But we do notice differences even in states. What we say, how we say it, what's intended. Politeness versus true honesty and emotion. And so high context is a lot of times where you are, just highly emotive, and low context is like I'm trying to really not be overly pushed on having to communicate too much. Masculine and feminine, even though gendering can be something that I think labels our types of gender or expression too much, there are societally attributed labelers or ideas attached to masculine and feminine based socialization. So the strong versus silent, or kind and communicative, assertive culture versus empathetic culture. We tend to put assertive culture as a masculine trait and empathetic culture as a feminine trait. Interestingly enough, though, I often tell people that if they really look at how we're doing culture today, we have stuck men into that assertiveness, and often they are wanting to express themselves empathetically. And often I'm seen as a very assertive person. I've often been called, very strong. Sometimes we get called bossy if we're a female, if we're too assertive. And so there's a lot of pushback from culture that sometimes tries to stress this too much. But we need to, once again, pay attention to that in our relationships. Are the people we're talking to expressing the traditional ideas based on the socialization of male and female or language, or are they challenging that? How you communicate might also be based on your family of origin. I don't know about you. How many of you probably have loud families? Some of you might have the quiet families. And when you interact with other people in your close relationships outside of your families of origin, you may be either emulating those traits that you have from your family, or you might be that person that has always felt like, my family is loud, but I'm quiet. So you need to recognize where you get your cues of how you communicate, because that family of origin where you were raised has shaped you. And this can often be a major issue when it comes to people in deeper long-term relationships. Families of origin teach us the traits and the norms, the values that we have. A lot of the times as we age, we may reject or change those, but a lot of times they're deeply embedded, and it can cause issues if the couple doesn't talk about it or people don't talk about it. The other thing is situations like divorce may affect how a person communicates. Sometimes we have traumas that are likely to create later on, as we talk in attachment theory, issues with communication style. We may not trust people, or we may not have that sense of security. Now, not everybody who's gone through the impact of divorce, especially children, always have the same response to it. I invite you once again to watch the video, The Impact of Divorce on Children. We'll carry that also into our divorce little module at the end of the 6 weeks. But I think this is important to recognize that we can divorce well, and that there are many children who have actually benefited from their parents divorcing because the situation was too difficult, and so their socialization has changed. What we really need are good communication skills. These create healthy relationships. And this is the most important thing in any of our relationships, that we learn to respect, communicate, put boundaries up, know also how to talk about things that are difficult. This video that I suggest, and if you have time right now to stop, I would go do it, by Dr. Joanne Davila, is an important video on healthy relationships and us also being very aware of our own needs. When we are aware of our own needs and how we communicate those, and also being aware of what our partner needs and being aware of their processes, then we're able to do a much better job at getting at the difficult issues that we may face as a couple, or as friends, or as family. So please take time to do that. And if you can't do that now, make sure to do that before the threading. So I have a little bouncy thing here, and I just didn't get that taken care of. But 3 important components that are listed by Dr. Joanne Davila is these 3 pieces. We need insight, mutuality, and emotion control when it comes to our relationships. She highlights these, and we're going to look at them individually. Healthy relationships have these 3 conditions basically that are evidence based on these skills. When you have the skill of insight, the skill of mutuality, and the skill of emotion and regulation, what's going on in you, not saying to suppress, by the way, but to allow yourself to really recognize what's going on, then these 3 conditions tend to show up where you know and like yourself because you have insight about what you want and what the other person wants. You know and like your partner, and your partner knows and likes you. There's a sense of recognizing that. So I know and like myself, insight. What makes you you? I want you to think about what others like about you. And this is something I often ask about friendships. It's a good way to look at how you present yourself when you think about how you present yourself to a friend. Now, often we can list, and I would love for you to go through that right now. Take a moment if you can, and if you want to pause this to do it, to write down all the things that your best friend or a couple of your friends that you consider very close give you in the relationship. What is important that they give you? And then in a column right next to that, I want you to write down what you give them. What are the things that are great about you that you know you're trying to help them be with them, or, represent who you are? This is good, healthy recognition of the things and the qualities that make you you. And it also gives you an idea of how to practice insight on others. To know and like your partner is also that sense of mutuality. What do your partners want? Okay, so going back to your friends, are there things that maybe you aren't giving to the relationship? Or your parents? Are there things you're not giving to the relationship with your parents? Do you like them? Um, what is it that is mutual to where you see that they're getting the benefit of being part of your life as much as you are getting the benefit of their life? Knowing yourself, but also knowing others and being able to be aware of that and sharing in that partnership is really important, and making sure that people have some of that mutual understanding from you, that you will make some sacrifices for them as well. And then also knowing that you don't have to play games. Really, emotion regulation is huge. How do we communicate and work at things together? Not trying to solve things, but come up with solutions. There's a difference between those two words. When we try to solve something, a lot of times we're trying to do something by the end of the night. I often tell people about this little exercise called the 10 and 10, which we don't have time to do in social groups, but I'll lift up here. A lot of times we are communicating over each other. Have you ever had that argument that went on for hours and you never got anywhere? This could be with friends, family, or that intimate relationship that you have. A 10 and 10 is a situation where you take 20 minutes. Usually it takes about half an hour, to be honest. And for 10 minutes, one person gets to speak. The person that's listening doesn't get to interrupt, but they're timing exactly at 10 minutes what the other person basically saying at the end of 10 minutes, they're done. But the person listening can also not make a statement in reply, but they can ask a clarifying question. Sometimes this can be over a difficult piece. For example, let's talk about the finances. That might be an issue. Or let's talk about the fact that you are ignoring me as a friend and I don't know why, or I feel ignored. That 10 minutes, we find that a lot of times we very rarely listen to somebody more than even 10 seconds before we decide to jump in. Afterwards, when you get through that 10 minutes of the first person sharing, the person listening needs to reflect. I heard you say, did I get that right? And that helps that emotion also come down, because after 10 minutes, you start to see the body and the mind and the brain stop the fight and flight and actually trust the other person. After that, and once you've identified that the person has been able to share how they feel and affirmed what they experienced, what they're going through, you flip, and the person that's listening becomes the sharer. They can continue with the subject, or they can maybe address something different. It doesn't have to, the rules are suddenly switched. And the other person listens, cannot make statements. That's often too judgmental, but often then listen with a full intent of getting at reflecting what that person has heard. And then finally at the end, asking if they got it right once they share everything they heard. Most of us, when we communicate, aren't going to solve a problem. Most of us are going to work on a solution together based on what we know. And once we get that out there, sometimes we recognize the solution is that we may be coming at something different. And it may take a little bit more time, but it takes the fire out of that argument. So I highly recommend that. Next, I want you to think about your favorite love songs. We're going to do this a little bit with one of your threadings this week, or the threading this week. How are we influenced by the world around us and how we're supposed to communicate? I will tell you that a lot of the love songs that I love, or a lot of the get down songs that I love, are not necessarily about insight, mutuality, and emotional regulation. But this says something. Once again, this is a great subject to do the final presentation on. What does our media tell us? And are we listening to good communication when we hear these social expressions of love that may or may not necessarily be telling us about good love? But at the same time, there are really great songs out there, and shows and movies and things sometimes that do. But for the most part, I want you to think about those types of things. This also tells us about our culture. We have a culture, like I said, that might be from our family of origin or even the communities we've lived in, urban versus rural versus suburban. And the values that group members hold, the norms they follow, and the goods they create are often something that shapes a person in their life. A culture is made up of values. All a value is an idea. It's held by individuals and groups. Certain examples might be people who believe in individual freedom. Once again, here that individualist versus collectivist idea. Social equality, that looks more collectivist. Religious authority, that's very traditional sometimes. Our personality, once again, is often shaped by that culture. And it's a construction just as much as love is. Remember, I talked about the social construction of love. Well, culture is a social construction, as is race, ethnicity, gender, beliefs. This means we ascribe certain characteristics to our own culture. We're also socialized differently. What socialization does in our communication is that if we're raised and socialized through a process in our family where we don't openly talk about things, or we see anger as either good or bad, that might be in our intimate relationships something we have to consider, how a person was socialized. And then how that gets reproduced. Are we trying to reproduce that in our families and our intimate relationships? Or are we learning that others might have different ways in which they get at that? The other difference is sometimes we have different beliefs, something we feel or think is true. That's different than a value. It really goes deeper. What do you think is true, and how did that get socialized into you? And sometimes we tend to think that beliefs other than our own, or cultures other than our own, can be weird and different. Now, if you're attracted to somebody that's from a different background, different part of the world, different culture, even in your own state, sometimes you will experience things that may feel weird or different. I want you to watch the video in Module 4. It's a TED Talk about weird or different, because it helps us to recognize that we all have different socialized backgrounds. And one of the ways that we can really avoid some sort of conflict is to recognize that we may have things that the other person think is weird or different, but that might be something that creates that curiosity and vulnerability for us to be attracted. Additionally, a belief is an idea or a theory about how the world is actually like what you think it is. It's a worldview. And so it's not easily something that somebody gives up, a belief about something. So if people are in intimate relationships with friends, family, intimate, deep, long committed relationships, sometimes we see belief as one of the hardest things for people to really get past, or you can't necessarily say, I want to try to change that person's beliefs. You often have to be in good communication about those beliefs, maybe respect them, maybe have to recognize that you may have different beliefs over time. Finally, evaluate yourself. What are your attractive attributes? When you're communicating about yourself, it's important for you to recognize your own idea of who you are, and not try to give that up in a relationship, but to add that to the relationship. What do your friends like about you? What attracts you to other people? What is important to you about who you are? The attributes that then we see happen a lot of times in the social psychology world, especially in this example that was in the book today, is that we see a lot of behaviors that are important in healthy relationships when people do these things together. One, coming to the table, knowing who they are, and also being aware that they're in a mutual relationship and they're trying to solve problems with each other, to know their partner, to pay attention to their partner, to be affectionate, to help each other, to really support each other. So what are your top 5 features that are you aware of as far as your expectations for a relationship? What's an expectation? It's a prediction about what you likely think will happen in the future and in that particular relationship. And so it's important to put that out there on the table as well. 2 examples of expectations that might be a challenge to some people who are experiencing a new relationship and they may not have asked these questions might be a religious belief. A lot of times people are attracted. Sometimes they start dating and they find out that they have different religious beliefs. Do you want a partner who shares the same beliefs as you about religion? That's something to think about ahead of time, even though that shouldn't get in the way of whether or not that relationship happens. A lot of people work through good communication about that to find good solutions to that. But it's important for you before you enter into relationships with friends also to recognize that you might have some of those beliefs that are important to you. Or household beliefs. What do you expect from a partner in caring for the household? Did you have some traditional upbringing where you did all the work in a particular way? Or is there a big communal understanding of how to do housework? Those are ways in which our expectations, if we don't think about them, can really cause some issues and conflict in a relationship. Another aspect of belief about yourself and others concerning a relationship is how you expect a relationship to evolve. Do you expect the qualities of that intimate relationship to be set in stone from the beginning, or do you adapt? Are you a person who tries to create new beliefs together over time? And then how do you approach making those changes together? We call that the locus of control. Changes in a relationship often happen from a central point, and you have to think about where you're coming from. Are you a person that does the internal locus of control, where you feel power to achieve goals that lie within themselves? And so you expect each one of you as individual partners to be in charge internally of your own goals? Or are you externally working at that, where you feel like every success really needs to be something you think of together, all your failures need to be worked out together? And where do you start from? We all have different uses of this, where we will sometimes be in the locus of control of our own selves, but then on other things, issues like finances and things like that, we may switch to the external. The other piece is that positive thinking always helps with our expectations. We see couples with higher standards and positive expectations have better relationships, but there's an opposite side to that, because some people have too high of a positive expectation that is too perfect, and there's a difference between the two P's. A perfect expectation is something that none of us reach. Positive high standards don't always motivate emotional reactions, and sometimes when we have too much of a perfect ideal, those are way too high expectations. And so what we find is people need to lower their expectations based on that perfect model, but they need to have high expectations of what they want in their relationships. And so avoid perfection, work toward positivity. On our module 4, I want you to pay attention also to this video by Brene Brown. She talks about vulnerability and belief. I think it's really important for anybody in a relationship with any of their family members, any of their friends, and any of, or of course, intimate relationships, for us to think about how we as humans often don't know how to walk about in this world being vulnerable or trying to be courageous about that. We find that couples who are more vulnerable with each other and friends who are more vulnerable have deeper relationships over time. So expect the best and understand that bracing for the worst is also important. It's the courage to be imperfect and to believe that vulnerability makes you beautiful. What we do with our vulnerability is something that we have to recognize over time as well. And as you watch this video, you'll see that Brene brings up these major points. First, in our society, as Americans, we tend to numb our vulnerability. Most of us are in this world that we're the most in debt, we're the most obese, we're most addicted, we're most medicated adult cohort in all of US history. And so we don't want to be vulnerable because we just really would rather avoid it. But being vulnerable allows us to not numb what we're doing, because if we numb it, then we numb everything and we make everything uncertain, to where we have to really allow ourselves to be more certain in our vulnerability that, yes, the world is this way right now. Maybe it always has been, but this particular cohort of what we're going through isn't something we should avoid. We also pretend that what we're doing doesn't have an impact on others. And really, in relationships of any kind, we have to recognize every single part of our life, even if we're thinking we're getting through it, may need to be shared with others. The very last thing to say on this section is what Brene Brown says, you are worthy of love and belonging. Let yourself be seen and love with your whole hearts. Practice gratitude and joy and believe that you're enough. I hope you enjoyed this module. I hope you have a great day or night.